We're live now, so all right. Welcome to our study tonight on Wednesday nights. This is new teaching quarter material. I guess technically, technically this new teaching quarter started last week, but I was not here. So I want to thank Terrell, I believe it was, that covered for me in class. He's a pretty good teacher, isn't he? And Don had covered for me. Don Huddleston had covered for my time away from the pulpit a week ago Sunday, and I trust he did a good job too. So there will be a couple other times coming up this summer, 2 Wednesday nights back to back. If you're looking at the outline or the packet, if hopefully you got that on the way in on this new series, this kind of first page here, page 1, shows you kind of the game plan for this quarter. There were actually more weeks in this quarter than typically. You have 13 weeks, but there was 2 5 Wednesday night weeks, which kind of makes it unique. But I have 12 sessions, and so there are 2 sessions that you'll notice the dates of June 29th and July 6th. Vacation toward the end of June, and July 6th, I'm speaking at the summer series at Clinton. That's my 2nd year in a row, actually my 3rd year altogether, to be able to go to Clinton for that series and teach to them. And I'm going to be teaching a very important topic on discipleship to that congregation. But the series, there's 2 first things that are, as you notice tonight, it's June 8th. First things first. When we're studying 1 Kings, and I've already got 2 first things I want to tell you about right now. Number 1, I've never taught class. I've never preached. I've never showed up to church in shorts before. And I'm sporting a new little knee brace that I can't get around my jeans, so I'm wearing shorts. But I'm going to try to keep the podium between me and the camera, so there will be no video evidence. Number 2, I've never taught on 1 Kings. Can you believe that? I have never taught 1 Kings. Now, I have covered many times 1 Kings in Old Testament survey type of lessons. Old Testament survey, or Life of David series, or Life of Solomon series, or sometimes the little vignette stories that you can pick out of the Kings. But I've never looked at 1 Kings or 2 Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles and have preached a series or even taught a Bible class on these. My plan is that I am going to learn a lot in the structure of the book, and I have already read it once through, and I was amazed. I want to be honest with you. There's probably a reason why I have veered away from 1st and 2nd Kings. I remember one time when I was preaching, my first full-time work was in Sealing, Oklahoma, and I was teaching the high school class, but there was another guy that was teaching the adult Bible class, and they were going through 1st and 2nd Kings verse by verse. I was at Sealing exactly 1 year, and I think that if I think about it correctly, they hadn't even made it halfway through 1 Kings. And I remember that people were commenting to me just how boring of a study that was. I won't mention the name. It's been many moons ago, okay? But I just wanted to share with you that I just didn't think that I could make it very interesting. I've read through the Bible several times, not bragging about that, but I hope you know that that probably is expected of your preacher to have read the whole Bible. So I have at least once. I've read it through, all the way through, okay? But 1 Kings is not my favorite book, but it's not one of the books that are, my worst, least liked either. That probably would go to Leviticus or the book of Numbers, just because the content there is very informational or ordinanced or too bland, although there's some interesting things that happen in Numbers. But if you like Leviticus, you could probably sit down with every volume of the Oklahoma Statutes and just go through it thinking that's wonderful reading material. But I can assure you, in my opinion, it's not. But it might be up your alley. But I have grown to appreciate books like Leviticus and Numbers and other books like that. But I always kind of felt like, well, 1st and 2nd Kings, okay. I'll just touch on them when I need the stories out of them. But I want to go through it. We're not doing it verse by verse. If you've noticed, this is a study called a survey of 1 Kings. Now let's look at this first page, and you'll see tonight is First Things First. It's an introduction. As a matter of fact, we're not even reading anything from 1 Kings necessarily, unless it's just for reference for the introductory part. We are going to read something from 1 Samuel that I think sets up the background for this study. But first things first, starting next week, you'll see that we're going to be in chapters 1 and 2 on securing the throne. There's going to be an issue about, at the end of David's reign, who's going to be the next king. And Adonijah is going to try to take the throne. But it wasn't to him that it was promised. David had said to Bathsheba, Solomon would be on that throne. Nathan the prophet's going to step in and help expedite Bathsheba along with others that are in the country to get Solomon on the throne. The third session, June 22nd, a wise choice and a bold ruling. When God asked Solomon what he desires, and he could have asked for riches, but he asked for wisdom. And then there's a bold ruling that takes place, a very radical ruling by Solomon, who sits as judge on a case that deals with a baby and 2 women that claim to be its mother. Then session 4 is a time to build. It's Solomon that's going to build the temple. That's why it's often referred to as Solomon's temple. David so much wanted to build, but God did not allow David because he had hands that had blood on them because he was a man of war. So that's session 4, a time to build. Solomon is the one in charge of that. And by the way, Solomon is the one who wrote in Ecclesiastes, there is a time to build and a time to tear down. Then I'll have a couple of breaks in here. June the 29th, Jim Shepard has agreed to be a teacher. And then I'm looking for a substitute teacher July the 6th. And what I'm going to have Jim do, and whoever is going to teach on July 6th, I'm asking them to cover a character study on first King Saul and then one on King David, because we're not covering those 2 kings in 1 Kings except for the very tail end of David's life, but really nothing about his reign. So these stories will be, of course, located in 1 and 2 Samuels. I am on vacation, then speak at Clinton, but when I get back on July 13th, session 5, God's second appearance and a queen's first. That's going to be chapters 9 through 10. I'm going through this with you so that you'll know that ahead of time, I'm expecting that you read the chapters that are in the parentheses next to the title. So for that one, 9 through 10. Session 6, wisdom has left the building. Okay, Solomon had too many women in his life that turned his heart away from God, and he goes spiritually bankrupt. What a way to remember chapter 11. Get it? Chapter 11, spiritual bankruptcy. Okay, you get it. Session 7, Kingdom Come. That's the series lesson, but this one's Kingdom Come Undone. This is the rock bottom place in Israel's history, is when the kingdom splits. If you saw the little graphic I had Aubrey put together and put out on Facebook earlier today, and what maybe I'll show on a slideshow, as we're going to have some slides occasionally, you saw a picture of a crown that's kind of split in two, a broken crown, because a kingdom will divide. And it's one of the most, I'm going to say, I was saying it's the pinnacle, it's a pinnacle of Israel's history, but it's not really a pinnacle, because pinnacle means a high point. It's a low point, but it's an iconic landmark spot in the chronology or the timeline of Israel's history that everybody can point to this, okay? And we're going to see how significant that division takes place. So that's Kingdom Come Undone. Chapter 8, we're going to have a string of a lot of kings who just did not want to do what God wanted. They do evil, and then they'll have a son that did exactly like their fathers did. The nut doesn't fall far from the tree. There's going to be maybe one or two good kings in there, but for the most part, it's like father, like son. That's chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 9, desperate times call for desperate measures. This is where there's a famine, and Elijah, the prophet, is going to be focused on here, along with the widow from Zarephath. That's just one chapter there. Showdown on a mountaintop. That's Mount Carmel, of course, between the worshipers of Baal, the prophets, who were trying to call down fire, and then, of course, Elijah is going to win that. Session 11 is going to be on chapter 19. The show must go on. Remember when Elijah wants to throw in the towel. Nobody has been listening. He has tried all he can, and yet God says there's still others that have not bowed their knee to Baal yet. Chapters 20 and 22, which will finish it, every dog has its day. I love titles, don't you? Every dog has its day. Now, why would I put that in the title? It's because of the prophecy God gave through the prophet about what was going to happen to Ahab, which does happen in 1 Kings, but the prophecy also covered what would happen to Jezebel, which happens in 2 Kings, and it has something to do with dogs. You won't want to miss that one. Every dog has its day. Okay, so with that said, let's turn to page 2, and we'll look at, in this introduction, a background to this. We want to frame this in the right way, and then about the book itself, dynamics of the book, not a lot there, then an overview of the 1 Kings, a timeline, and that timeline will go on to page 3. Then frequently asked questions about the tribes, because when you get into divided kingdom discussions, there are sometimes people that get confused, and there's a good reason for that, and I've got some explanations for that. Then we're going to talk about the kings. That's page 4. You will have a list of kings of Israel. You'll have a list of kings of Judah, and I've supplied a list of notable prophets. We'll get to that, and then some timeline notes and some other interesting facts. Finally, on page 5, you will see that I have basically more of the interesting facts and some questions for discussion at the end. So that's what you've got for tonight. Again, just reminding you, pick up your packet on the way in each night. I'll have these 3-hole punched, and you can start you a little 3-ring binder. I'm writing this as we go, so it's not fully developed, but I have finished this session 1, and I have worked on about 3 or 4 other sessions kind of simultaneously, and I'm going to have about 4 or 5 ahead. Maybe next week I'll even have 3 or 4 sessions worth of notes for you, because I'm trying to do all my research and collection, kind of trying to front load it at the beginning, and probably I'm going to hopefully by midway through have everything done, so you'll have all the whole thing. You're just bringing it all with you to class. Does that make sense? Let's look at the background. Now, I could have started in the garden. I mean, sometimes I'm wondering how far back do I need to go to paint a background, and I'm going to assume I don't need to go to the garden, okay? I felt like, well, we need to kind of get into this discussion of how they got to the promised land, though, and I could have started with Abraham about the promise of going to the promised land, but it's not needed. Again, I don't think I have to go to Abraham, but I did want to kind of go to the end of Moses, where they start making their way as they leave Egypt and go. So Moses led Israel to the promised land following their time in Egypt. They had been in Egypt, by the way. God's people had been in Egypt. Does anybody know how long? 430 years, okay? And Exodus and Deuteronomy will record the Exodus, okay? And Joshua leads Israel into the promised land. Moses could lead them to it, but Joshua had to lead them in it. Why? Why didn't Moses lead them in it? He had disobeyed God at the rock when he should have just talked to the rock, but he struck it instead with the rod. And God did not allow him to go in. He did allow him to see it, and died and was buried on top of Mount Nebo. But Joshua would be the one to take Moses' spot. So Joshua leads him into the promised land. Now, when he goes into the promised land, you've got the famous story of the walls of Jericho fell down. Then you got that little debacle that happens at Ai. Can you spell that? Ai. eye, okay? And then that gets resolved, but then there's a Gibeonite deception that takes place. There's a lot of these stories, but basically Joshua's job with Israel is to do exactly what God said for them to do, which was drive out all the inhabitants. And they kind of went across, and Jericho first, then Ai, then onward. And then I can't remember if it was a southern campaign first or a northern campaign first, but it's the conquest period of conquering these lands and driving people out. Were they successful 100%? No. The Gibeonite deception was a one of those pitfalls, right? Excuse me. Let me get a drink of water here. Running dry. So they were not able to successfully get rid of the people. Why would God want all the inhabitants of who lived there gone? Because they were worshiping false gods. There was Baal, there was Asherah, there was Molech worship, there was Dagon. The Philistines had the god Dagon. There was all kinds of polytheism going on, pagan rituals going on. And God said, if you allow them to live there as your neighbors, they will influence you. How many of you know there is a power of influence by the people that you're next to? Okay? When you're with people that are not of the like-mindedness that we are, there can be an influence. I'm hoping that we are assertive enough to know that we have an opportunity to be an influence to them, right? But we also are smart enough to realize it can be difficult on us. There's a New Testament passage that talks about those who have fallen. Pick the ones that are spiritual to go and restore them. Why? Why? This is in Galatians 6. Why do you pick the ones that are spiritually strong to go restore them? Because if you pick the weak to go, they could be susceptible to whatever wrong that they're doing, to the failures of their faithfulness. So it's to restore the weak, you send the strong. So not everybody is at the same strength level, spiritually speaking, as others. And so be specific on who you send, okay? There's a point of influence there. Now, when Joshua conquers the land, and then they're able to divide up and divvy it up to the land allotments among the tribes, then there's a period of time after Joshua's gone called the Judges. And there's about 15 of these judges, men and women, who God raised up as leaders. These are not the kind of judges you think of in a courtroom. These are people who, during times of crisis, God used, who God tapped and said, be a leader. Get up and let's do the assertive things to bring people's memory back to God. Because there was a cycle going on in the book of Judges. If you ever studied Judges, one of the constant refrains is there was another generation that came up that didn't know God. And therefore, because they'd forgotten God and who He was, they relapsed into being far away from God, and they were in need of restoration. So there's these judges were restoration leaders. You've heard of the American Restoration Movement. Israel had restoration movements all the time, at least about 15 different cycles of them. Can anybody name some of the judges? I'm not going to have you name all of them, but can you name any of them? Deborah, the woman, one of them, a woman, Deborah. Who else? Not Samuel. Samson. Somebody else say one? Gideon. That's one of the first ones I think of, is Gideon, who's threshing out the wheat in the kind of hiding, and God calls him to go and fight against the Midianites. Okay, so that's one. Anybody else? Samson. Okay, we all remember the strong man, right? Okay. Well, those are the judges, and they were just leaders during times that God needed a leader. But it's during this time that God's people, because of their failure to have driven out all inhabitants, and because of the influence of rubbing shoulders with their neighboring countries, who all had their kings, that there was this yearning desire of God's people to be like everybody else, to have a king. After all, God's having to bring up these judges anyway. Why don't we just have a monarchy? Why don't we establish a king? And this is kind of where our story will start. Because even though most of what we'll see in 1st and 2nd Kings are about the divided kingdom, the united kingdom, which only lasted 120 years, by the way, is the first set of of kings that are reigning for God came out of this request, even though God stated, I want to be your king. I want to be your king. And the prophet in the center of this whole thing, the prophet that was kind of between the people wanting the king and God saying, I want to be your king, was who? Samuel. And Samuel acted as a prophet and a priest, and you know what, come to think of it, I believe he might be considered a judge as well. I need to look at my list, but Samuel is this one whom his mother had prayed for during the priesthood of Eli, remember? And he thought she was drunk when she was praying for her son, and we know that story. So Samuel is kind of buffering, no, God wants to be your king. And finally, God says, let them have their king. It's not you that they've rejected, it's me they've rejected. So what we're going to do now is turn to 1 Samuel 8, and I don't know how many of you saw this, because I put this on maybe 4 or 5 hours ago for tonight, if you saw this on Facebook, to read 1 Samuel for tonight's lesson. That's the Bible text I'm in right now. So we're going to look at 1 Samuel 8. Again, we're still in this background of our study for 1 Kings. It says in verse 1, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba, but his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. There's a lot that happens when you gain power. And when power is kind of delegated to you and you're not ready for it and you're not spiritually prepared for it, it can go to your head. You can often, how many times have you heard of people that have won the lottery and then they just, not very much long after that, they have become bankrupt because they don't know how to handle people who are successful in being millionaires, worked their way up to being millionaires, and they were ready for it, okay? They knew how to manage their resources. But something like that, it just falls in your lap. Sometimes people are not mature enough or ready for it. It's kind of like the prodigal son who got all his inheritance, but he wasn't ready for it, was he? And it says in verse 4, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. What are the things you're hearing them say to Samuel? First of all, you're old. You ever like people come up to you and say, you're old? I'm starting to get that now. By older people, not just young people, older people. You're getting older. See, your knee, you see. How about you're old and your sons don't follow you or respect you? How does that make you feel? As a leader, as a person that's kind of seen as a spiritual leader, I'm not an elder, I'm not a deacon, but as a minister, I'm still kind of in a position where, that can hurt, can't it? And then it says, and we want to have a king. What's the reasoning here? We want a king, why? Everybody else has a king. Why can't we have a king? Okay. Verse 6, when they said this, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. And I'll tell you why it displeased Samuel. Samuel has a heart for God. Samuel's heart's been given to God. It was dedicated to God by his mother many years ago before he was born, and he's always been devoted to God. And he's defending God's kingship. We need to be like Samuel, by the way. I don't know how you feel about modern-day monarchies, but I think they're baloney, to be honest. I think God is King of kings and Lord of lords, okay? I believe Jesus Christ reigns on his throne right now. I don't think when I said kingdom come as the title of this lesson, I kind of thought, well, some people are going to think I'm thinking of the Lord's Prayer where Jesus is praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I'm talking about a kingdom that is here now, okay? We are in the kingdom, and God sits on that throne and has delegated it to Jesus as all authority has been given to him according to the Great Commission passage. So we see Jesus as our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I feel like I need to defend that. And that's how Samuel felt. And he prays to the Lord. In verse 7 says, and the Lord told him, Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they've rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they've done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now, I don't know how much time has transpired. Now, I know when they leave Egypt, it takes about 3 months to get to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. They're there about a year to get all the instructions. Then when they leave there with all the set of plans and things they have made for the temporary temple, the tabernacle that's going to travel in the wilderness, and all the furnishings that go with it, including the Ark of the Covenant, altar of incense, table of showbread, the water basin, all that stuff travels with them. I know that they go to Kadesh Barnea, and there they send out 12 spies. And remember, only 10 of the 12 come back saying, we can't go there. They're so much larger than us. There were only 2 of the spies that said, let's do it. God's going to be behind us. Who are they? Joshua and Caleb. And they're the only 2 that remained alive in the crossing of the Jordan when they went in. Because all that generation died. You can't tell, there's no way of knowing how many graves are in this wilderness. Because it was estimated during the time of the crossing of the Red Sea out of Egypt that there was anywhere from 1.5 to 3 million Israelites at that time in that traveling caravan. Can you imagine? I know what it's like last week to travel with 44 people in 5 vehicles. And I thought that was pretty rough. I mean, go to Burger King and have just one person pay for it at the end and see how you like that, because I think we were upsetting people behind us, don't you think? We did pay because we felt bad for the ones because they only had one person at a cash register. But that's another story. I don't know what they're going to do if they pulled in at Burger King with 1.5 million, you know. I like Burger King, by the way. But you have this factor of, okay, they're traveling. Joshua and Caleb, obviously, they've got the faith. Here Samuel's got the faith. They're wanting to do what God says. We can do this. But they're in the minority. Samuel is all alone on this. I don't see anybody else that's on Samuel's side trying to defending God's kingship. I don't see anybody else among the spies except Joshua and Caleb saying, why don't we trust God? He's proven himself. He's proven himself, but it doesn't take long, does it, after God does a good thing, for you to forget about it or take it for granted or expect it the next time, and when it doesn't happen, then you blame God for it. It doesn't take us long to do that. You know what I mean? So that's been at least 40 years. I don't know how much time, I didn't look it up, is during the time of the judges before we get to this point with Samuel. But it's a long time. A lot of different generations coming and going. Remember, I said there were 15 cycles. It says in verse 9, now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. There are times that God has an ideal. He has an expectation, and it's his ideal situation. For example, he makes man to be an eternal being. Did you know that? We were made in his image to dwell with God forever. This was not going to be a short-term life. But he said, if you sin, you'll surely die. You'll become mortal. When mankind sinned in the garden, and Adam and Eve both partook, that's the separation that took place. Why they were driven out of the garden, no longer having access to the tree of life, which made them immortal. That's what that tree of life symbolizes. The next time we see the tree of life is where? In heaven, in the book of Revelation. When we access the tree of life again, it's when we're in heaven. That's the eternal life. God's reasoning of driving man out of the garden is this. Now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, we cannot allow him to reach out and partake of the tree of life to eat and live what? Forever. Now man's days are going to be numbered. That's the fall of man. From eternity, from immortality to mortality. Okay? And so when that happens, God's ideal has to now become concessionary. And what I mean by that is, and God has a contingency plan. What I mean by that is what God wanted didn't happen. And you might think, why did God make such a mistake? Question, was it God's mistake or was it man's? It's man's. Sometimes when I'm studying with people who have not studied the Bible at all, when we're talking about this scenario of Genesis in the origin of man and the fall of man, sometimes the question is asked, well, why did God give them the choice to even pick evil in the first place? Because God gave them choice. God created us so that we'd have choice in the matter. And I know you may be thinking, well, what's the big deal about having choice? Those of us who are parents or have been parents probably realize it's greatly appreciated when one of our kids comes up to us and they please us or they say something nice to us, and they don't just obey us because we told them to do it, but they initially initiated it on their own and they did it willfully. You know, I can tell my son or my daughter, I want you to say to your mother and I love you, Mom, I love you, Dad. Okay? And they'll say it. It doesn't mean nearly as much when they do that as if when they do that on their own without me telling them to say it. Because now I know it comes from them or they're needing some money. Those of you who have kids that have been to college, you know what I'm talking about. So I love you, Mom and Dad is so much greatly more appreciated. And God's that kind of a God. After all, we're made in His image. This is how we feel. We would rather them out of their own volition, their own initiative, come to us and say these things that are terms of endearment. Am I right? I don't want you to just do it because I told you to. I want you to do it because you love me. When I say, I love you, Mom, you know, sometimes I might get the answer, well, good, prove it, you know, back that up. And God wants to be a God who is served by our willfully serving Him. Okay? But along with free choice comes all the consequences of bad decision making, which even affects others who are making good decisions. Because guess what? My free will might get in the way of your free will. Your free will might bump into about 5 others' free will. And before you know it, the bad decision of myself in a disregard to an instruction or a principle that I should have been paying attention to could affect other people who have no fault in that at all. You know how that works. Okay? So we all have free will. That's why there's wickedness. That's why there's pain. That's why there's suffering in the world. Okay, enough with that. He goes on to say, what I was coming up to is that's God's ideal. But He has a contingency plan, and sometimes He has to concede. Now, what does concede mean, or what is concessionary? What does that mean? It's God's plan that we had the tree of life forever, that we would never sin. But since we do sin, have sinned, and all have sinned, He has a contingency plan. It wasn't His ideal desire for us, but He reaches out through the atoning sacrifice of His Son, Jesus, to save us. Okay, that was the concession. It wasn't God's plan that there'd be divorce. But because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed for a certificate of divorce in the Old Testament. That was a concession. There's many other examples we could bring up where there's a concession made that you can patch things up with God. But I don't want anybody to think that the price is paid by us. The price was paid by God with His Son dying on the cross. Okay, we'll go on. It says in verse 10, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. And this is kind of a scare tactic, but it's 100% true. You know this is true. This all makes sense. We can look at just most monarchies and see this is exactly what a king or queen, any monarchy, has the power to do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of the chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, until others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys. He will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. That's a whole list of things. And I'm thinking Samuel's probably thinking, good, this will deter them from wanting a king. Did it? It's as if it went one ear and out the other. Because what we see next in verse 19, the people refused to listen to Samuel. Now what's that mean? They might have heard the words, and A, either didn't register, or B, they didn't care whether it registered or not. Because their answer is, basically their answer is this: we don't care. We still want a king. Oh, I can think of many times where I'm thinking of younger people who have come to me saying they want to be out on their own and they're tired of living under the roof of mom and dad, and they don't realize the realities of bill paying and taxes and maintenance to your car, and that you're going to have a flat, and then there's rent due. And it's like, for some, they're not listening. And, you can see it coming a mile away. They get into a situation, and they're kind of in the ditch, so to speak. And you try to tell them. And I don't know where the gaps are on training or getting kids to understand how to balance a checkbook, how to be responsible financially. Now, I know Haley was a perfect girl in this, and she had everything figured out. She's just smiling at me over here. She had everything figured out. Thank God Ben found Haley, because she saved his life probably, right? Are you the bookkeeper in the home? I knew it. Then you have, there's a lot of things that people, the prodigal son. I've got all this money, what am I going to do with it? Along with great wealth comes great responsibility. But if you're not ready for responsibility, the wealth is going to go out the door. Dave Ramsey's his philosophy is, if you don't tell money what to do, money's going to tell you what to do. And you're just going to go after things that the money is saying. You get the money, buy it. The problem with our society today is even if you don't have the money, buy it. Buy it now, pay for it later, and then they're surprised when the bill comes in the mail. Well, that's just a vicious cycle that we can get into. I know this about borrowing money. I'm not thinking it's a sin, but I will tell you there's a passage that says, and I forget where this is, that the borrower is subject to its lender, or slave to its lender. So that's a principle I think we need to wake up to and teach our kids. He is trying to tell them, here, if you want the king, okay, but you need to know this first. And I'm thinking Samuel really is hoping, okay, maybe we don't need the king. We'll do it God's way. But they don't say that, do they? They've got a better way. Why do they say we want a king? It's in the next verse or two. There's two reasons they give, and that's the first one. How many times in any bad decision ever made does that comprise the answer? We want to be like them. How many times have you heard that in various scenarios? You want to do things because they're doing it. Johnny did it. Billy's doing it. Bob's parents let him go to that party. Why can't I go? Right? And we're like that. What was the second reason? He will fight our wars for us. Did they not just hear what God told through Samuel was going to happen? Is God really going to fight your war for you? Is a king going to fight your war for you? What did we just see Samuel say? Your sons and daughters are going to fight those wars. And I don't think it registered. Oh, the king will do that for us. Oh, the king all by himself is going to be able to do that. Okay? Now, it says in verse 21, when Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord, and the Lord answered, listen to them, and give them a king. And this is where you read between the lines and can conjecture that this sets up the time that God down the road is going to be able to say what? I told you so. Exactly. I told you so. But I think it's interesting how Samuel reacts. We know God's decision. He's already made up his mind. They've already rejected me. There's no point in arguing with a wall. They've made up their mind. You know people like that do not have an objective attitude at all. They've made up their mind. And they've made up their mind. Samuel's still holding out. And Samuel doesn't get the answer he wants from the people. And I don't think he likes the answer that God gives. Give him a king. Because what's it say next about Samuel? Oh, everybody, just go back to your home. It's like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. Just go back to your houses. Sleep on it. You know, wake up in the morning, it'll be a different story. He doesn't like how this is going. And I don't blame him. I don't blame him at all. Because he sees the handwriting on the wall of what this is going to do. And that sets up the background to 1 Kings. About the book of 1 Kings. Jewish historians believe Jeremiah is the one that wrote 1st and 2nd Kings. By the way, 1st and 2nd Kings is actually a single work. It's not that they set out to do a 1st Kings and later on we're going to do a 2nd Kings. It was all Kings, but guess what? It's too large to fit on one scroll. It had to go onto 2 scrolls. Okay? Remember, it's on scrolls. It's not in a book like this. It's on scrolls. And so it's 2 pieces of the same work, written in about 550, we think, while Jeremiah is during the Babylonian captivity years, somewhere around there. It covers about 150 years worth of time frame with Israel and Judah. Okay, let's look at the overview of 1 Kings. This is still page 2. I'm speeding this up a little bit. 1 Kings begins with an attempt by Adonijah to become David's successor, to be Israel's Israel's 3rd king, because we know that Israel's 3rd king was Solomon in the United Kingdom. And this is kind of neat. And whoever's doing Saul and David, you're doing Saul, right? So Saul's 40 years, David's 40 years, and Solomon's 40 years. So that's 120 years right there. They had equal time spans. And those first 3 kings comprise the United Kingdom years. And then the kingdom divides. And then there's a host of Israel kings and a host of Judah kings. Okay? Nathan the prophet is going to step in and help Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, to expedite David's naming Solomon as his successor. He's already made that promise to the mother, but he needs to publicly do this before David dies. David dies and Solomon rules as Israel's 3rd king. And then 1 Kings 12 is the major turning point. And in my opinion, with the exception of the fall of man in Genesis 3, this is the worst chapter in the book as far as mankind's relationship with God. Well, I guess you could argue the flood too. But this is an iconic landmark timestamp that everybody can refer back to, that will lead to the exile years and to the captivities. And, the kingdom being torn apart. God does not like splits. He doesn't like church splits either. We see that in this book, the remainder of 1 Kings and all of 2 Kings records these 2 lines of kings in the divided kingdom till their respective exiles, with the ending of the fall of Jerusalem. So if you were to take a timeline, let's see, from the way you're looking at me, from your left to going to your right, using Ussher's dates of about 4,000 or so for the beginning of the creation and all that, which I like using that date because I'm a young earth person anyway. But you kind of come along there, and the flood's around about 2,500. Let's see, Abraham is about 2166. And then you've got... So that's going to be after when was the flood? Okay, I'm going to get the flood mixed up. So 4,000, but let's go to Abraham. 2166 is about the birth time of Abraham. Then you come along, and by the time you get to Moses, you're around 1500, about 1440 or 1450 is the Exodus. 430 years of Egypt dwelling, and then you've got the short time spans that are happening kind of in between there. By the time you get to David, that's about 1050 BC, I think, somewhere right there. So that's coming across from about 4,000 to about 1,000. There's about 3,000 years there, okay? Everybody following? Okay, when you get to David, well, there's first Saul, 40 years, David, 40 years, Solomon, 40 years, 930 BC, 930 or 931 as some of the timelines show. 930 is when it splits. Rehoboam and Jeroboam has the revolt, and now you've got two lines of kings. This is why it's confusing to read 1st and 2nd Kings as well as the Chronicles, because every chapter heading kind of starts off, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Jehoshaphat became king of Israel, okay? So you reference off of each other. Sometimes it's referenced off of not just one of the Israel or Judah kings, but off of one of the other kings, like the king of Aram, or the king of Hiram, or some other king, because there's a lot of other kingdoms going on out there. And then one of them, kind of the northern kingdom, cut short because of Assyrian exile. Which kingdom was it, Israel or Judah? Israel, 722 BC. Realize the dates are going backwards in counting because we're coming up to 0 AD, right? So 722, and then the southern kingdom keeps going for another 70 years, or they go into captivity and are in captivity for 70 years. That's in 586 BC. That's the times of Daniel and Jeremiah, some of the other prophets. Most of the writing prophets, by the way, are toward the end of those timelines. But that timeline splits, comes across, and then it kind of filters out. And then it's during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah where you can kind of see the timelines kind of converge again. And of course, it goes for a little bit, about 400 years before you get to New Testament stuff. That's just in a nutshell how that timeline works. We have a timeline I've written here. You can just go through that on your own. I'm not going to go over that tonight. It's for your reference. Frequently asked questions about the tribes. Why are the tribes always referred to as the 12 when there are actually 13? All right, first of all, let's discuss Levi. Priestly tribe, not a normal tribe. We knew that from the beginning. You would have all the tribes that were camped around the tabernacle area, but Levi was all around the temple court area. You had Joseph as a son of Jacob that's not named as a tribe. What's up with that? Joseph being the son that was sold into slavery and was second in command next to Pharaoh, he becomes this savior of his whole family, the reason why his father Jacob and the family moved during the famine years so that he could protect them, and that's when they started their living for 430 years in Egypt. Joseph gets a double portion. And sometimes these two sons of his are called half-tribes. What are they? Who are they? Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh. So Ephraim and Manasseh are going to have land allotments and considered tribes in Joseph's honor, okay? And so that makes it 12, but Levi still makes it 13. But 12 is a collective reference to the 12 sons of Jacob. I gave you a little mnemonic device here. Bald, rings, JJZ. You can remember, this is not in the order of the sons of Jacob, but this little bald, rings, JJZ is a little way of remembering who the sons of Jacob were. These are the beginning of their names: Benjamin, Asher, Levi, Dan, Reuben, Issachar, not a truck, Naphtali, Gad, Simeon, Judah, Joseph, and Zebulun. Did you get all that? I've got them listed there. But Ephraim and Manasseh takes the place of one of the J's, okay? And then, of course, the L, the Levi, is taken out of that mix. Still collectively referred to as the 12. All right? Ephraim and Manasseh are referred to collectively as the house of Joseph. They're considered half-tribes. There's also the fact, that takes care of that. There are Transjordan tribes. Transjordan or Jordanian tribes are those who had land allotments that were still on the east side of the Jordan River, and one had on both. Manasseh had west and east. They were going to camp out there, 3 different land allotments. But Joshua said, you still got to go fight with us in the conquest years. Then you can come back and live and settle there. Remember that? That's what's meant by Transjordan tribes. That's Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Question 3, what is the difference between a tribe and land allotment? Again, it's just they pretty much, generally speaking, have the same name as the tribe. But we'll notice something about the tribe of Simeon. It's in the southern part. It's surrounded by Judah. If you've got one of those color maps in the back of your Bible about land allotments, it's got different shadings. How many of you have a Bible like that? Notice Simeon's kind of a little circle there. Simeon gets cursed during the Judges book, and they get absorbed. Simeon is really no more other than just being absorbed either into Judah or in the northern tribes. They are still considered one of the 10 lost tribes. The lost tribes refer to those of the north that rebelled following after Jeroboam. The 2 that are the southern tribes are Judah and what other tribe? Benjamin. So Judah and Benjamin are southern tribes. Even though Simeon's down there, Simeon is not mentioned as being a part of the kingdom of Judah. They're counted in with the kingdom of Israel, or they basically don't exist. Okay? They just kind of got absorbed. And of course, again, you don't have land allotment for Levites. And you might ask, well, was Levite northern kingdom or southern kingdom? And the answer is both. Because as you know, Levites were scattered all throughout, because they were the priests serving all of the tribes. So when the kingdom divides, the 10 northern tribes are now known as Israel, even though beforehand all of them were Israel, but now that's going to be known as Israel. And the southern tribes known as Judah. But they also have alternate names. The northern tribes, known as Israel, also could be referred to as Ephraim, and that's because Ephraim is where Shechem was, in the hill country of Ephraim. That became the capital that Jeroboam had set up. The capital of Judah, of course, was Jerusalem. And the place for worship for Judah was Jerusalem. The places of worship for Ephraim, or the northern tribes, or Israel, were in 2 places. Remember, Jeroboam set up shrines in Dan and Bethel. Bethel is on the southern border near Jerusalem. Dan is on the northern border. So they would go and worship their God. And the point about that was Jeroboam didn't want people to have to think they still have to go to Jerusalem to worship God and do their sacrificing. Because if they go down there, they'll revert back and will join Judah. Let's keep them up here, so we'll set the shrines up where you can do your sacrificing up here. Okay? So you got a place to go in the north if you're closer there, or you got a place in the south if you're closer to there. That was the reasoning behind that. Okay, let's go to page 4. Here's our list of kings. There are 20 kings in each kingdom, 20 of them. Now, some of them didn't reign very long, less than a month sometimes, and 2 or 3, actually several of them co-reigned together, either rivalry or they were co-regent. Some of these overlapped, okay? But let's go through the list of names real quick so you can get a pronunciation. Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Tibni, Omri, Ahab, Aziah, Joram or Jehoram, Jehu, Jehoahaz, Jehoash or Joash, Jeroboam the second, Zechariah, Shallum, Menem, Pekahiah, Pekah, Hoshea. On the kings of Judah, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Athaliah, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. I also gave you a list of prophets. Now, one thing you'll note is in each column I have a line. You see the line? That's just indicating to you what's being covered in 1 Kings. Above the line is 1 Kings. Below the line, they're in 2 Kings, with the exception of the prophets. For example, you got Elijah and Elisha above the line. That's where we start seeing them, but they're also in the southern, or not the southern, they're also in the 2 Kings narrative, if that makes any sense. But 1 Kings will cover to the end of Ahaziah and Jehoshaphat's reign. Can't talk tonight, okay? Other interesting facts. This is toward the bottom of page 4. We're close to the end here. David is the only king of all kings. I mean, there's 20 in the north, 20 in the south, then there were 3 of the United Kingdom, so that's 43 kings. David's the only king listed in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Fame of the Faithful. There are more judges listed in that Hall of Fame passage than there are kings. What did God think about kings again? Isn't that interesting? And obviously we know why David would make the list. A man after God's own heart, right, Barbara? A man after God's own heart. Yeah. We don't have anything from the kings in Hebrews 11. The only other person that was considered a king that's mentioned in Hebrews is way before this, and that's Melchizedek. Jesus is priest after the order of Melchizedek, and I think Melchizedek, if I'm not mistaken, is also considered a king. But you have Gideon and Deborah, and I think Barak is mentioned in the Hall of Fame. These are judges. I just think that's interesting. Every single king of Israel is considered evil. Every one of them. Not a single one of them is considered good by God. How many of the southern kingdom do you think could be considered good? I mean, it's there in the bullet note, but 8. 8. Do you know which ones are? Hezekiah is one. I didn't bring my notes to say which ones are good, but Asa is the first good one. And there's 5 altogether somewhere in there. I think it is Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. But when you get to Manasseh, Manasseh is like the worst. Manasseh is the worst and reigned the longest. And you don't get to another good king until Josiah. Josiah is probably my favorite king of the kings of Judah. You know why? Anybody know anything about Josiah? What's an interesting fact about Josiah? He was 8 years old when he became king. But it's during his reign that Hilkiah found the book of the law. It had been missing. And they discovered it. And Josiah basically dusted it off and said, "Here, we do this." And he enforced every one of those that he saw in the book of the law. The prophets are some of them, most of them are oral prophets at the top of the list. Oral meaning they didn't write a book like Elijah. There's no book of Elijah or Elisha. But you get down to the bottom of the list, you have the writing prophets. Okay? And of course, when you get down to Manasseh on the southern, or the king of Judah, kings of Judah side, that's the middle column, which are the southern kings. From Manasseh to Zedekiah, there's no correlating king in the north because they've all been exiled. So the list that you see in the first column, they all fit into the time frame that's squeezed from Rehoboam to Hezekiah's time. Just because the list is the same length, you got to remember those kings were all squished up in there during that time. Manasseh and following, that's a whole lot more years that they were able to be in kingdom before they go into exile. I don't think I wrote this, but the northern kingdom goes into Assyrian captivity, and the southern goes into Babylonian captivity. When I say southern, that also included what Assyria had, because Assyria was overtaken by Babylon as well. There's an interesting supplement that is available for your reference. I've typed in an address you can type in about getting the dating right of all the kings. It's about a 17-page deal. If you want to copy this, you can. I just didn't want to really make a bunch of copies of this unless you're really interested. For the geeks out there that are really into accurate dates, I love this chart, his thorough research here. In closing, why do you think God conceded to allow his people to have kings? You're going to have to learn on your own, right? Have you noticed today people are interested in monarchies? There's so much going on, like in England, that gets people's attention, like it's the latest trend or fad, and everybody wants to know what Prince this is doing, Prince that's doing. Anytime there's a wedding, there's big fanfare. The thing about the queens, all the things that are going on there. I've always found that interesting. Another question I had here is, what correlation do you see in today's world and the kingdom years of the Bible? Do people still forget God sometimes? Even after God's proven himself to them? Yeah. Are there any times that we think we have a better plan than God has for us? There shouldn't be. We should always think God's always got the better plan. What happens in the lives, families, and careers of people who forget about what made them successful in the first place? And in an affluent society like we live in now in America, it happens a lot. We call it one word, spoiled. Or as I heard an old-timer say, spoilt. Like spoilt milk. That milk is spoilt. What do you personally hope to gain from a study of 1 Kings? I know I've said that I've never studied this. Have you? Has any of you ever done an extensive study of 1 Kings? I'm just wondering. You have? You taught it, okay. Good for you. You've done something I had not done yet. A minor study, okay. You've read it. Do what? You've been through a class. Was it verse by verse? Okay. Haley, have you ever read the Kings? A crash. Oh, you had it at OC? Yeah. It wasn't Kings, but there was a teacher that had a class on Ezra to Nehemiah, and I heard it was a bear. I didn't take this class. I forget the teacher's name now, but here's what I was told. The final was you had to write a paper on everything you learned in that class, and he said the deadline is like, he set the deadline. He wouldn't be in his office, but he said, if your paper can fit under the door into my office, you didn't write enough. That was the test of whether your paper was going to be accepted or not. If it could fit under the door, it wasn't thick enough. Well, who was that? Who was that teacher that did Ezra and Nehemiah? He would have been around when you were there. Oh, man, I forget his name. I can't remember his name. Anyway, that's a start, and I went a little bit over. Sorry about that. But next week is going to be where the interesting stuff happens, because the way I'm intending to do this, I'll be done in about a minute. The way I'm intending to do this is I'm going to come in assuming you've read it. I'm not reading it, but I am going to summarize it. And I love to tell these stories. I will be making notes every week of what I'm going to tell you, the highlights, the bullet points of what's going on. Then we're going to get into discussion about what's going on, okay? So I'm going to be prepared to come in and say, okay, here's what you and I read. There's trouble. There's a king trying to assert himself as king. There's a guy trying to assert himself as king. His name's Adonijah. That's how I'm going to start next week. And I'm going to have a little funny introduction for each one of these sessions. So with that, let me go ahead and sign off. Again, I'm hoping not to have to print a lot of these. What I think will happen is I had printed, are any of these left, by the way? Yeah. Okay. I will leave those on the table for those of you watching at home. If you'd like a physical copy of this, maybe when you're here next time, make sure you picked it up. I will probably be able to post these as a document on Facebook so you can download them yourself, but I don't want to have to keep going back to the copier and making copies of stuff, okay? So collect these, bring them all back. I think that's all I had to say on that. Next week we'll be reading chapters 1 and 2 for next week. So let's sign off with that. We'll see you Sunday, Lord willing.